Thanks again, Peter, and good evening, everybody. As Peter said, I used to be a consultant. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, did I think I would be doing what I'm doing now? I would have said probably absolutely not. But in the early part, probably around 2012, I started to become aware of some economic trends that disturbed me so much that I thought, well, actually, I should stop consulting and I should really take this seriously. And I researched and wrote the book that Peter mentioned. So I haven't got time to go into every detail of it. But what I thought I'd do is to explain to you what it is that made me so concerned. So I'll share some slides. I won't talk for very long. Then we'll have a quick question and answer. Then I'll talk a bit more. Then we'll have another question and answer, and then there'll be a working session where you get a chance to discuss your thoughts and then feed them back. So let me just share my screen. So I've called this presentation Malice in Plunderland, and really the theme of it is that we are facing a situation where our country risks being turned into a plunderland. I'll explain what I mean by that. And the next election is the most important of our lives. So first of all, I'll explain why I think that is, which is that the UK has underperformed since the global financial crisis. It's underperformed economically, but more importantly than that, it's underperformed for its citizens since the global financial crisis, and more recently, it's underperformed more seriously for its people. Secondly, which is related to that, we have a new kind of government. We have a kind of government we've never actually seen before in the UK, and it threatens our democracy. And therefore, the working session will be us talking about what we can do before then. So let me start with the underperformance. And let's begin with the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So this chart has got two lines on it. You can see the blue line, the higher of the two lines, is indexed real, that means inflation adjusted GDP per capita. So it's GDP, if you like, is a measure of the size of the economy. But if the economy goes up 10% this year in cash terms, and we've got 10% inflation, that means the real GDP hasn't changed at all. And in fact, if the population's gone up by 1% this year, then per person, the economy would have shrunk by 1%. So you can see that since the global financial crisis, we've never returned to anything like the trend that we were on before in terms of GDP. And the red line is a similar thing. It's real median earnings. So that means what the person in the middle of the income distribution is earning. That has never recovered. And indeed, people now are, most people are poorer than they were in 2007. We haven't had a period of falling wages like that since the 1820s. So this is a real serious issue. And the worst thing is that the pain hasn't been spread evenly through the population. So we had, after the global financial crisis, we had two things. We had, as policy responses, we had quantitative easing, where the Bank of England has now created about 895 billion, so nearly $1 trillion in new money, and it's used that to buy assets. So asset prices have been going up through this period, which means that if you're rich and you have assets, it's not been a bad time at all. But if you haven't got assets, which in fact is most people, then it's been a tough time. And the other big policy response was austerity, which was justified on really two arguments, both of which were false. The first one was that they said that our level of government debt was worryingly high, and we'd never seen anything like it before. Actually, even now, it's much higher now than it was in 2010, but even now it is just around the average that it has been for the last 300 years. So there's nothing unusual about this level of government debt, which is a mind-blowing thought, but it's a simple fact and easy to verify with Bank of England data. The second one was they said that they had to do austerity because if we lost our AAA rating, you may remember that up until about 2012, we had UK government debt was AAA rated. And they said if we lost that rating, then the cost of borrowing would go through the roof. So this was necessary pain. But we did, of course, lose our AAA rating, and the cost of borrowing continued to fall because it's controlled by the Bank of England. So there was never any risk of it spiraling out of control when we lost that rating. So that's bad enough. But if we look at what it means for the poorer people, then you can see that it's been really terrible. The top line on here is the number of homeless people. This is all these data are pre-COVID. And so you can see a tremendous rise, nearly a tripling in the number of homeless people. The next line is the number of food parcels that are being given out according to the Trestle Trust. So you can see a sharp rise up to 2018. For last year, astonishingly, it was over 2 million. Extraordinary number of people, most of them in work, who are having to rely on food parcels now. And the bottom line is the number of people who died from homelessness, according to the Office for National Statistics. They don't publish these data very often, and they're not probably hugely reliable, but their estimate for last year was that it was about 700, they've estimated 688 people died from homelessness. About 90% of those were men, and most of them were in the 45 to 55 age range. And perhaps startlingly, about 40% of them were in London, which is, of course, the richest part of the country. So in the very richest part of this quite rich economy, we've got the concentration of deaths from homelessness. So all of that is pretty shocking to me, at least. But then, of course, in 2016, we had Brexit. So this chart is just saying what impact did that have, first of all, on the economy as a whole. And so you can see the horizontal axis is growth between 2010 and 2021. So that's the whole time span. And that was pretty bad because we were behind most countries, but we were at least at that time better than Greece, Italy, and Brazil. But the y-axis, the vertical axis, is showing you where we've been relative to those countries since Brexit, since 2016. And unfortunately, we are worse than all of those other countries in that period. So if you shrink the pie, and this is that same measure that we saw before, real per capita GDP, so that's, you can think of that as the size of the pie. If you shrink the pie, somebody's going to have to get a smaller slice. And again, it's been the poorer people who have borne the brunt during Brexit and COVID. And this is what the Bank of England says is going to happen. So towards the left, you can see the historic figures, but here are their projections. And you can see for this year, they're forecasting the biggest slump in living standards since they began compiling these records, and next year will be also a bad year. So economically, since the global financial crisis, and particularly since Brexit, we have been doing very badly. All countries, of course, have suffered to some extent, especially this year, but our inflation is running at a higher rate. So our population is suffering worse. We've done less. We have not had price caps. When I wrote this presentation, the government was refusing to contemplate a windfall tax. Since I wrote the presentation, the government has now decided it is going to do not a windfall tax, but a limited, short-term, targeted, profit-based tax on energy companies. And possibly there's going to be some further support in benefits, but there hasn't been any of that yet. So we've had a succession of bad policies, and that's created this situation of mass impoverishment. Most people in this country getting poorer, and the biggest burden falling on the poorest. And so I said I would explain to you what it was that concerned me, that made me give up consulting and start looking into this in more detail. Essentially, it was that, and the thought that if we carry on with this trend, by the year 2050, the UK won't be a civilized, prosperous Northern European democracy. It'll actually much more resemble the way South Africa, which is currently the world's most unequal society, it would more closely resemble the way South Africa is today, where you've got a tiny elite who are monstrously wealthy, and they live very, very comfortable lives, but they have to protect themselves with expensive security because the rest of the population is either in or not very far away from poverty. And I thought, I just don't want to see that happen in this country. So that was what made me stop consulting. So I thought I would just stop now and take any questions for a few minutes, and then move on to the next part, which is about this government specifically.
You've had the book, and it's had, I believe, good reviews. What's been the response from the, should we say, the major political parties and the powers that be? Do they recognise that, or is this a classic case of heads in the sand again?
I think there's a great deal of heads in the sand. When the book came out, which was 2019, the Financial Times recognised the book and kindly made it one of their books of the year. But and I had thought it's just possible that some politicians will reach out and say this is really interesting, but that didn't happen. We have been reaching out actively to politicians, and we're beginning to get the first inkling that there are people who might be prepared to listen. But it's amazing how keen they are to keep their heads in the sand, is the honest answer. I can see Philip's got his hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with you that Brexit is one of the worst self-inflicted wounds we've had recently. Do you think there's any chance we will recover some of that lost economic growth, etc., when we sort of readjust and get used to the idea of Brexit and find ways around it, or find other outlets or whatever?
I think if we remain, in many ways, we've erected barriers with our biggest trading partner. If we leave those barriers all in place, then obviously they'll continue to have a dampening effect. At some point, the growth rate should begin to stabilize if we don't have a series of damaging policies. So, Brexit, you said, is possibly the single most damaging policy, but austerity is of the same order of magnitude, actually, in terms of the damage it's done to the economy. So the short answer to your question is it all depends on policy. If we have good policies, I see no reason why we couldn't get back to a much more attractive rate of growth, and why we couldn't also share the benefits of that growth more fairly. So what we talk about in the book is growing the pie a bit faster and sharing that growth fairly. I think both of those things are possible, but it all depends on policy. Oh, Patsy, yes.
Okay, so I've just unmuted. People don't read books very much these days, do they? Your book is a great book. I usually tell people to go to the end first to read the summaries so that they, kind of know where they're going, sort of thing. So that's a criticism of where we're in as a, in relation to books and reading and engaging with that sort of thing. The presentation that you've just done with those visuals is amazingly accessible, and so is your explanation. Is there anywhere that's online, on any social media anywhere?
Well, most of the content is online, it's on the website, but we are recording this, and one of the things that I should be doing is trying to get that onto our YouTube channel, and I know that the Richmond group also is planning to share it with their members. So this presentation itself will be online. There's already one on a similar topic that I did, I think it might have been last year, for the University of the Third Age in Sheffield. That's already on the YouTube channel, I think. In terms of books, I think you're half right. I think book sales are continuing to rise, actually. So I presume that people are reading them, but they do only reach a small proportion of the population. So when I was writing my book, one of the things I was aware of was that there were some quite good books that covered some of these issues, but they were mainly written by economists for economists, and they weren't really accessible to very many people. So I did my best to make the book as accessible as possible. And I think it is much, much more accessible than some of these other books.
Sure.
But to be honest, it's still not, it won't reach some readers. So, it was the FT that reviewed it, not the Sun. So there's still a challenge to make things more accessible, which I think is a really important challenge. And I do my best to be accessible, but I recognise that there may be other people actually with a better gift for making things even more accessible than I have done. I think what I've done is to take some complex issues and set them out logically so that an intelligent, well-read person can understand them. But I haven't made it absolutely Sun reader, Daily Mail reader level of accessibility.
But you did in the first 5 minutes of this session. It was amazingly accessible, and you're very good at writing. But you do have to have people who are engaged in reading. Yeah. And people do buy books and don't read them because they're, and at the moment, when I want somebody to know about the 99%, I get hold of a book and give it them. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that does what I want to happen in a way that presentation that you did at the beginning, if we could have access to something like that we could pass around to our mates and.
Yes, well, hopefully you will have very shortly.
Really good, thank you.
So that will be good. Gia, I see you've got your hand up.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. How hopeful are you that this government is going to come up with a decent policy or decent policies? I
don't think there's any realistic chance that this government will come up with good policies. I think this government has an agenda, which is what you're kind of leading on to what I'm about to say in the next session, actually. I think this government has an agenda which is not aimed squarely at the benefiting the UK population as a whole, which is what you would want a government to be doing. And therefore, we will need a change of government if we want to see an end to this succession of damaging policies.
I wish there was someone there that could take over, someone that we could trust that would take over. Yes, well, but good.
It would be nice to have a really, really good government, but actually this one is so bad that an average government would be a very big improvement. In fact, probably almost any government that we've had in the last 70 years would be a big improvement. So even if we don't get anything like perfection, there's a good chance it will be a significant improvement.
We'll hang on to that thought.
Yes. So I'm not counting on perfection. I'm just after a big improvement, really.
Thank you.
Has anybody else got their hand up? I don't see. Oh, yes. No, that's again. Right. In that case, I'll move on to the next part of the presentation then. And we'll have a chance for more question and answers after that. So there we are. So the second part is basically saying that I believe we have a new kind of government. It's not just that it's a slightly worse government than ones we've had before. It's actually that it's a different kind of government and that it threatens our democracy. So this is perhaps a bit more controversial than the first part. See, so we're used to a situation where we have arguments about big state and small state. So typically the left, the position on the left would be the state can add value, sometimes more than businesses. So the state should have a very significant role in the economy. And then on the right, we have a view that says, well, we actually know we should have a small state because state activities they don't face the discipline of competition, and that means they're prone to inefficiency. So really, we should only get the state to do things that the market can't do. And that's probably been the traditional discussion for much of my life politically. But of course, you can be more extreme than that. You could have an all-state view. You could say, look, businesses are predatory. Inherently, capitalism is evil and money grabbing, so the state should do everything. Or you could go to the other end of the spectrum, as Ayn Rand and her followers did, and say, well, the state is a predatory institution and it should be kept as small as possible and it should have nothing to do with business. And I actually think that we had at least some elements of that with the Cameron-Osborne government. He didn't say that's what he was doing. He talked about big society, but actually the idea of big society, I think, was that you could shrink the state and charities and so on would fill the gap. But even that's all still on this same spectrum. It's just a slightly more extreme version of what we've seen before. This government, I think, is different. I think this government is building a plunder state, which takes a completely different view. It says, well, actually, the state is an enormous profit opportunity if you can control it. And we've seen some startling evidence of that during COVID, during the handling of the financial crisis. I'll just pick on a couple that I think are particularly eye-catching, I suppose. These are not the only examples. So many of you will remember the scandal around the procurement of personal protective equipment. This chart here is not by any means a complete record. Everything on here is true, but it's missing an awful lot. I just stopped trying to track it when it exceeded $1 billion. But this is money, taxpayers' money, that was transferred to companies that effectively had no track record in this area, but they were very, very well connected with ministers. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the work that the Good Law Project and Byline Times did, uncovering this VIP lane that the government set up to allow VIP contacts of ministers to bid for contracts, for example, to supply PPE, and they got preferential treatment. So that meant that they crowded out established suppliers. If we just take the top one on here, Ienda Capital, it's not a healthcare supplier, it's actually a family office. It's like a small financial business whose reason for being is to make one particular family wealthier. And so it handles their investments for them. It does their tax planning for them to make sure they don't pay any, and that sort of thing. Its expertise is financial, but it's very, very well connected with the government. And so they recognized that they could offer to act as a middleman, and they could, because of this VIP lane, win a contract. So the contract they won was over 250 million. So that's almost £250 million that went to this company to provide PPE. Now, they didn't have a single factory, so what they did was to sign a contract with factories in India and China, who then provided some PPE, but unfortunately, none of it was usable. So the government spent almost over £250 million of our money with this company, which is connected with ministers but had no expertise, and received nothing usable in return. So people died because of this. NHS staff were not properly equipped. Had they followed normal procurement procedures and gone to established suppliers, fewer people would have died and vastly less, smaller amounts of money would have been spent. So that's probably the worst single example. It's certainly the biggest, but you can see there are lots of them. And it wasn't just PPE, there were all sorts of other areas where huge amounts of money went to unqualified companies. And in many cases, what was delivered wasn't usable. So that's terrible, but that pales into insignificance when you compare it with the test and trace, which, as you probably know, the government appointed illegally, apparently, Baroness Dido Harding, who's a close friend of the Prime Minister, to run this programme and allocated £37 billion to it. That programme then largely sidelined the NHS and funneled huge numbers of contracts to, again, via these VIP lanes, to companies which are well connected with the government. And so the National Audit Office has looked at least twice now at that programme, and it's worth reading the National Audit Office reports because they're really scathing. But the mind-blowing thing is this idea of £37 billion. I find it quite hard to think what 37 million really means, but 37 billion is a colossal amount of money. So I looked around for something that was about the same, and I discovered that the combined budget of all three armed forces, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, for 1 year is about 39 billion. So it's very close. So they have spent over, or allocated to spend over a 2-year period, the same as 1 year's budget for all three armed forces. Now, if you drive around the country, you can see the evidence of the armed forces. You can see army bases, you see lorries driving around, you see helicopters, you see fighter planes, you see cargo planes. If you live by the sea, you see frigates, and probably don't see submarines very often, but frigates and carriers. You see where billions has gone. You can see it with your own eyes. With the test and trace, I've seen no evidence of it when I drive around the country. Occasionally, there are a couple of people in a car park with a little gazebo, but that doesn't soak up very much of the 37 billion. So it's just mind-blowing to think where that amount of money has gone. And even that shrinks when you think of what's happening with the NHS, where the government has now passed a health and care bill, which effectively gives ministers and these new integrated care board full control over the NHS. If what you want to do is to shift the UK system towards the US system, all the powers that you would need, you now have as a result of that bill. Now, at first glance, you'd say, well, why on earth would anybody want to? Because if you look at this, you can see that the US system is vastly less efficient. They spend more than double what we spend on healthcare, and they get worse results as well. They've got noticeably lower life expectancy than any of these other developed countries. So it looks like the worst system in the world from the point of view of taxpayers and from the point of view of patients. And actually it is. And in addition to that, I don't know if you knew this, but 2/3 of personal bankruptcies in the US are caused by medical bills, as opposed to none here. So at first glance, you would say, why on earth would anybody consider that an interesting model to look at? Well, the answer is that actually the US system is the best in the world in terms of profit. It's the most profitable healthcare system in the world. So if what you're trying to do is to maximize profit, you want to move us that way. So that's going to be a disaster for most people in this country, because healthcare is hugely expensive. Even at the rate that we're currently paying it, most people couldn't afford to pay their own. It works because we have progressive taxation. If we had a system that was 2.5 times more expensive and you had to pay it yourself through an insurance scheme, which is much better, much closer to the way the US system works, then we would have that same problem with health-related bankruptcies going on all over the place. So I've given those 3 examples because what I think we've got is something which is qualitatively different. We look at this map and we think, well, this is a country. It's got citizens, they have rights, they have aspirations, they have skills, they have strengths, they have weaknesses, they have preferences. But it's all about, doing the right thing for the people. We have a government that doesn't look at it that way at all. They say, no, this is a profit opportunity. So they're not actually a low tax party. And you may notice that we've got the highest tax rates that we've had for 70 years. They keep saying they're very keen to lower taxes. Actually, the only taxes they've lowered so far have been taxes on the wealthy, on banks and things like that. They haven't lowered taxes on ordinary people. In fact, they raised national insurance. They froze national insurance thresholds, rather, so which is something which catches the poorer people. So what we have is something qualitatively different. It's a government which doesn't exist to serve the whole of the people in the UK. It really exists to serve a very, very tiny group, probably numbered in the thousands rather than the millions, of extremely wealthy people for whom this kind of transformation would be very beneficial. So when you see that, you think, well, surely that means that with that track record that we've seen, with that mass impoverishment that started, with Partygate, etc., they're going to be kicked out of office. And of course, they're quite worried about that. In fact, they're worried about anything that could constrain their power. So this is a sort of picture of how checks and balances on government are meant to work. And you can see there are lots of them, most notably the electors. But they've just put through an elections bill, which means, first of all, they've introduced the need for photo identification for voters. So you need to show them something like your passport or your driving license. Now, there will be ways around it, but many younger people, many poorer people don't have photo ID, and they will have to get over an additional hurdle if they want to vote. We have had up until now an independent body, the Electoral Commission, which is to make sure that our elections are free and fair in this country. Because of this new bill, it's no longer independent. It now reports to Michael Gove. So at the next election, it will be Michael Gove who decides whether the election is being run freely and fairly, which I find a scary thought, I have to say. We have, in a sense, we have a free press, although about 80% of it by readership is owned by 4 billionaires who are offshore tax avoiding people who have a very, very strong vested interest in the government. And during COVID, the government provided support to selected media outlets. Conversely, it's attacking media outlets like Channel 4, which are seeking to hold it into account. So that aspect of the check and balance is really not working well in this country. We no longer in this country, which is very unusual for a European country, have the right to peaceful protest. There are plenty of dictatorships around the world which don't have that right, but it's pretty unusual in Europe. I think it's only Hungary and Turkey that don't have the right to peaceful protest until now, when we have joined them. We have a courts bill which is challenging the right of courts to circumscribe illegal behavior by government. You may remember, for example, that the government wanted to prorogue, well, it did prorogue Parliament, and the Good Law Project and others took them to court, and it was found in the High Court that they had behaved illegally and they had to reconvene Parliament. They wanted to prorogue it to avoid any discussion of Brexit so that they could push through a hard Brexit on the 31st of October. And that didn't happen partly, or to a large extent, because we were able to challenge things in the courts. That ability is being restrained. A number of the laws they're putting through now contain what's called disguised legislation. The House of Lords has a scrutiny committee which looked at the Health and Care Bill, for example, which is something I looked at closely myself, and they said it contained an enormous amount of disguised legislation, which basically means that it gave so much power over the UK healthcare system that ministers could do essentially whatever they like without ever having to face further parliamentary scrutiny. The civil service, most of the top posts in the civil service have been purged and replaced by people the government likes. So instead of getting independent advice from the highest caliber of civil servants, which is what all previous governments have done, they are now getting advice from civil servants who are prepared to go along with what they want, which means, in some cases they may still be very competent, but they're not getting the best and they're not really getting independent advice. And we talked about regulators in the sense of the Electoral Commission, which is meant to regulate behavior. They have made that one essentially a puppet, which is perhaps the most important, but they wanted to put Paul Dacre, who's the former editor of the Daily Mail, they wanted him to be in charge of Ofcom to regulate all the other media. So, this is a very systematic attack on all our democratic safeguards. And this is something which a lot of traditional Tories have become very concerned about. Ken Clarke gave a very, very powerful interview saying that he believes we're not far now from being an elected dictatorship. And finally, we've seen the fundamental part of government should be to satisfy voters' needs. Well, we have this long now history of mass impoverishment, and we've got the worst cost of living slump for a generation. Clearly, voters are not being satisfied, but nothing's actually changing. So these are issues which relate to this government, but they transcend party politics. This is what Philip Hammond said on the left. And then on the right, you can see a list, which is probably not a complete list, but it's long enough to fill up the rest of the slide, of Tories and former Tories who have expressed similar sorts of concerns. And that's a hell of a list, actually. Of course, you'd expect politicians from Labour, Green, Lib Dem to be saying this sort of thing, but these are all former Tories who are saying it. So you would think, given all of that, that the next election would be an open and shut case, that the government's performance is just so bad that they're bound to be kicked out. But I don't think it's at all clear. So this chart is based on data from the House of Commons Library, which looks at the results of every election since 1918. And it's looking at the size of the swing. And if you look at the data, what you see is that there seems to be inertia. So if you were starting with a big majority, that matters. That affects where you're likely to end up. It's not that you're notionally starting with a blank slate at the beginning, in which case I think we would be virtually certain of not having a Conservative government retained. But it's as though voters are reluctant to change their minds despite whatever's going on. So there's inertia in the system. And when I looked at it, what I saw would be that to get a Labour government winning outright, that would require a swing of around 120 seats towards Labour. And that has only happened less than 10% of the time. So very crudely, you could say there's a 90% chance that won't happen. And this chart is saying, well, what would have to swing away from the Conservatives for them to lose their majority? They'd have to lose about 40 seats compared with the last election, and that kind of swing is obviously much more common, but even so, it's only happened about 30% of the time. So it's just not a foregone conclusion. So I think all of this adds up to saying that the next election is just different from any previous election that we've seen, and we should treat it differently. The stakes are far, far higher. They're higher economically because we are facing this prolonged mass impoverishment, which is intensifying. It's not getting better, it's actually getting worse. But most people are not really aware of that, and they're not really aware of the threats to democracy. So I think if they were aware, many more people would not be voting for this government, and therefore a huge challenge is to raise awareness. But the third conclusion I draw is that the government won't be unseated by a fragmented opposition. So the stakes are high, there's an enormous amount to play for, and that I think is why we should talk about what we can do before then. So I'll stop sharing now, and we can have a few more questions before you have the chance to go and talk amongst yourselves, and then feedback. David, you have your hand up?
Can you put the previous slide on, please?
Yes.
3 options, well, the 3 scenarios. All right, I think that's it. I wanted to just take notes.
Okay, fine.
I have to speak about this.
We can make the whole slide pack available. So if anybody wants the slides, we can share them afterwards. Gia, do you have a question? Your hand is up.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant and so depressing.
I'm sorry.
May we share this with anybody, these slides?
Yes.
Absolutely anybody. Because as you said, we need to raise awareness, and very few people have had it explained to them so straightforwardly in such a short time. And I think it's brilliant. I want to send it to every single friend I have here in this country who's a voter, and anyone who can possibly has influence. Yes, so I can share it with anyone. Yes, your presentation.
You can, because as I say, we will hopefully, assuming the recording works, be putting this whole presentation onto YouTube anyway.
Oh, brilliant.
So
brilliant.
It's going to be publicly available. So there we are.
Okay, great. That's wonderful.
Yeah. I was just actually going to say that, Gia and Mark, that this would be. It's not just the slides. I think the way you've articulated very, very succinctly. It's one of the best presentations I've seen, and I don't give that praise out lightly. I'm a pretty cynical bastard when it comes down to many things, but no, this is this needs to be out there. You can't just keep this, holding it like that. Everybody has to know this, and the more platforms we can put this on, it will start a dialogue.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And I see Philip and then Carol have their hands up.
I may be jumping ahead, Mark, but you say we shouldn't have a fragmented opposition. Do you think if people really understood this, some new party would appear? Because Her Majesty's opposition doesn't seem to be getting this message across at all.
I think because of the point about inertia, a new party would probably not help. I think what we really, being pragmatic about it, I think what we need is a progressive alliance of parties like the Lib Dems, the Labour Party, the Green Party, and conceivably SNP, if they realise the magnitude of the importance. I'm not sure they do. I think they think we're not going to interfere in English politics, but actually I think the stakes are so high that they should join in.
Okay, thanks.
That's my personal view. Carol.
What are the obstacles to sensible publicity on television and programmes that people might watch?
One obstacle is that a lot of the media are controlled by people who don't like this message.
Yeah, quite.
And even the BBC is not quite controlled, but it's both the Director General and the Chairman of the Governors are Tory appointees, Tory donors, and the BBC is constantly being threatened with loss of its license fee. So I think a lot of BBC journalists, as individuals, probably share some of these views, but whether they dare to be quite as forthright as I am, because I can't lose my job because I haven't got one, but they can, and you know, that's a serious consideration for people. So I know not very many, but I do know one or two BBC journalists who I'm convinced are intelligent enough and well informed enough that they would know everything I've said, but they never say anything like it. Jeff, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, that was absolutely brilliant, Mark. I think the fear I've got is when it comes to elections, most people say they take no interest in politics, but then they vote. And what they vote on is how they feel on the day, emotion, which I think is part of the popularity with Boris. People say, yeah, I could have a drink with him down the pub. Right? And your argument, as with Brexit, the stay in your argument was completely rational and sensible. The Leave argument was just emotion, and people voted on emotion. So how big a factor, and that may well be the argument that you described as being inertia.
Well, I think you raise a really important point. The Leave campaign was very, very clever, and that was also something we have never seen before. So they used social media, not just social media, but they did use social media and extensive polling to build very, very detailed psychological profiles of people. So, for example, they had ads where you could click if you wanted to save the polar bears, or click if you wanted to go green, or whatever, click if you wanted to save the NHS. And then they would target ads at those people and say, if you care about the NHS, vote Leave, because that's going to be good for the NHS. If you care about saving polar bears, vote Leave, because that's going to enable us to protect the wildlife better. So, so they did what in marketing terms is micro-segmentation, and then they did false advertising. They basically promised each person that individual's wildest dream. And because nobody else was promising to meet their wildest dreams, a lot of people said, well, actually, yeah, this sounds good. So it was very, very clever, completely unscrupulous, and it is not something that operating alone, the 99% organization can compete with, because we just don't have the scale and capacity to do that. We are talking to a lot of other organizations, some of whom may have that capacity, but we can't ourselves resolve that problem. I think what we can do is a small part, but an important part, which is just to get the facts out as clearly as possible. And I believe there is a very positive contribution from that. And especially if we can get opposition politicians to understand these facts, which I think most of them don't yet. It seems extraordinary, but I think that a lot of it they don't quite understand. More and more of them do, but still I think the idea that this could really be a pivotal election, this could be, you know, for a generation, this could be our last chance. I don't think all politicians realize that it's that serious. So
no. Yeah, what surprised me with Leave voters, there was a segment of which I encountered of wealthy pensioners who weren't really going to be affected whether we leave or stay, but voted because of arguments about sovereignty.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it's very difficult to argue with people because there wasn't really. You know, if you ask people, well, name me a law that you don't like that's come from the EU. Actually, I never came across anybody that could even give me one example. The one thing people did say was about bendy bananas. And so I took the trouble of actually reading what the EU directive on curvature of bananas was. And it didn't say you can't sell bendy bananas. What it said is you can't call them grade A if they're excessively curved, which seems a perfectly reasonable thing, and certainly not something that you would want to sacrifice the future of your country to for the rights to call them grade A when they're excessively curved. But it wasn't really a fact-based thing. It was down to emotion. They found out what people were afraid of, and they were afraid of loss of sovereignty. They were afraid of Turkey joining the EU and 80 million Turks coming into the UK, and they targeted those ads on the people that they knew were afraid of that, and they said, we need our sovereignty to stop this happening. Yep. So it was very, very clever. Hartley, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I think one of the things that strikes me you're going to have to talk about in the next thing is how is the opposition, i.e. them, this kleptocracy, which is what effectively it is. And then I think about the phrase that came out yesterday, we got away with it. Why and how do you think that they think that they're going to keep getting away with it? Because that is actually in their minds. I'm not sure that they are actually kleptocrats in the traditional sense. It seems to me to be a sort of, as you say, an in-group, a clique. They sort of feel that they'll all be appropriately off. It's an entitlement rather than aggregation of wealth. So we will all keep our positions and our entitlements if we all support each other. Is that how they think about it, or are they actually actively plundering?
I think it is. I think there are two different categories, actually. I think that there are certainly people who are actively plundering. For example, some of the beneficiaries of this largesse during COVID, some of those billions of pounds, the people who got that, I think that was active plunder. I don't think they really cared whether they delivered anything or not, as long as they were technically meeting some kind of specification and they could get paid. That's all they cared about. They didn't care that this was crowding out established suppliers. So those people, I think, were kleptocrats. I think some of the people in government who are facilitating it are almost like useful idiots for the kleptocrats. So they're facilitating it. They will, they'll be looked after. They will, as you say, they'll keep their positions and they'll keep their entitlements and so on, as long as they keep funneling money towards the kleptocrats. So I think that there are various groups involved. And then there are people who are a bit more innocent, but nevertheless complicit. So, all of these people have parked their money offshore, and there's a whole industry of tax advisors who are doing it. They are complicit, but they're doing it because that's what their expertise is and they want to feed their families. They probably aren't completely aware of how much damage what they're facilitating is doing to society. Andrew, I see you have your hand up as well, and that maybe should be the last one, just in terms of time.
Thank you, Mark. Firstly, I found this extremely interesting. I'm going to circulate this across our team within the business, because for somebody who is very quick to profess I am not somebody of any form of economic upbringing, this was bang on message. Thank you very much. One of the things I picked up on, a lot of people have said about with the Brexit was very much about what's imposed on us. The message seemed to be forgotten quite what impact we have had on Europe. I'm in the transport sector. We do a lot of stuff around regulatory compliance. The actual basis of the entire setup of driver's hours actually comes from the 1968 Transport Act. Right. That Europe said, we like that, let's take it, improve it, change it, add a few extra arms and legs and send it back to everybody. So I think that was forgotten. And we need to remember that was part of the impact that we had on Europe. It wasn't just a one-way flow. And I think that was where the fear message certainly spread. because we do a lot of consulting to a few large clients in France. And some of them were practically in tears when they found that we were leaving, and when they got to the point of Brexit and we were still leaving, and they were genuinely upset at some very high business levels, not just on the streets.
Yeah.
And there wasn't this same reaction that we got from the French politicians. The man and woman on the street in France and in business was, from our perception, was very upset that we were leaving.
Yes. Well, I certainly have friends in other countries who were horrified when they heard that we were leaving. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think, you know, obviously our current government has soured relationships with Europe, but whether those relationships would stay bad if we had a replacement government that spent a bit of time and effort rebuilding trust, my suspicion is they would be very cautious, because they would say we've been badly burnt. But I think if they were persuaded that what we had was really a different government, they would be open to very constructive relationships. Right, so I think we should move to the discussion groups. So I'll just share my screen quickly and set up the question that we were going to ask you, and then Peter's going to explain the logistics. So just before we do that, this is our website, and here's the book. I haven't got time to talk about all the things that we're doing, but we are in various ways campaigning to raise awareness of these issues, to tackle the most damaging legislation, to do various other things. Peter mentioned that he's involved with one of our projects. We've got a lot of stuff going on, which I could easily take half an hour, but that's not what we're meant to be doing. So afterwards, have a look. It's 99%.org. Have a look at the website and see what we're doing. And if you're interested, we would be delighted for you to join. But this was what we were going to ask you to talk about in your groups. I've basically set out a problem, and I think obviously lots of groups can help, but I think in particular consultants are well placed to help in two different ways. As individuals, consultants have certain skill sets. Obviously, each consultant has a different speciality, but you know, things like project management, data analysis, problem solving, communication design, change management, strategy, those sorts of things consultants have particularly good skills in, and other things that I haven't listed. So the first thing to think about is, as individuals, how can consultants help to get the UK back on track? But also as professionals, consultants have some unusual things. They have access to senior executives almost always. Sometimes they have access to the media, politicians, civil servants. Are there things in your professional role that mean that you could help to, again, to get the UK back on track? So that's what we were going to ask you to do. And Peter is going to explain the logistics now, I think.
Yeah. We're going to, Sally, please intervene if I get this wrong, but we're going to split into 3 groups for about 15-20 minutes. And then there will be feedback on both questions from each of the groups. And we'd like you to do the feedback in around 60 seconds, if you could, and then we'll open up for debate. Very kindly, David Rigby, David Jefferson and Philip Taylor have agreed to be the feedback people from the groups that they will be in. So look forward to hearing the results of your jury's deliberations, finding how we can help try and turn things around.
Absolutely right. Ready to go?
Welcome back.
Hello.
Hello.
Right. time for us to get the feedback. And David Rigby, could I ask you to summarize what the answers to the questions in your group were?
Yes, there are 3 people in the group. One of them, me, lives abroad all the time. One lives half the time abroad. So we've got half representation of the UK. As individuals then, we think we can go out and be engaged with people, but we have to be very careful about not being accused about not being professional in what we do. And therefore we need to support the information with the documentation we will all have. On the professional side, things like we can go out to organisations such as Rotary and similar things and give the presentation using marked slides. That's about the most positive thing we can do about it, even though it might arouse lots of argument and suspicion. That's a really good thing to do. Go out, use these slides, and it won't be as good as Mark, but it'll still be better than nothing at all. That's it.
Great, thank you very much. And we'll go through all the feedbacks, and then Mark can comment on what he's heard. David Jefferson. David, you're muted.
I've challenged his leadership in this.
Oh, right.
Because he said things that were really a bit crazy. So, well, he needed to be convinced. He wasn't convinced, he needed to step back. Well, anyway, I've challenged it. Okay. So I'll tell you what I think as individuals we can do. I have hundreds of contacts on my my Gmail, which lots of people try to access. I shall, as soon as this is on email, on YouTube, I shall send the link to all my contacts and urge them absolutely on to watch this. The other thing I've discovered recently is Russell Brand's, not a podcast because it's a video channel, which is, I'd never heard of him before. I'd never seen him as a comedian. I just thought he was a drug addict. His video channel is absolutely brilliant. He's very articulate. He's got all the facts. He doesn't give his opinion. He just gives you the facts. And he's got 5.6 million followers. I am going to write to him and send him a link and urge him to watch it and to deal with this subject. I don't know whether I'll have any success, but I shall continue doing that until I'll write to him every day until I get a reply, first of all. Secondly, I mean, he's absolutely brilliant. If you haven't watched him, you should. Secondly, during the ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous demise of democracy during the pandemic, when the media was completely taken over and there was only one narrative and everybody else was silenced, I joined the Together movement, the ones that organized the protests, which I went on in London, and which, of course, the media said there were a few hundred people, whereas there were thousands, and I mean, at least 50,000. It was the whole of Piccadilly was full of people. Piccadilly, as in the street from Hyde Park to Piccadilly Circus. And I'm going to contact them and get them. They haven't got 5.6 million people, but I'm sure it's a huge movement. And I'm going to give it to them and ask them to divulge it to all the people that they are they're on their books, on their things. I'm a visiting lecturer at university. I would love to say this to my students, but I don't think I can say anything political to them. I can suggest they read the book, but I'll have to be very careful, and I will ask how I can do this. I am already going to send it to the children of all the people I know who are young people who vote and some of them who don't, and get them to divulge it on their social media to this. So this is what I will do as a person. As a consultant, I don't think there's a very small chance of changing the political views of senior executives as a consultant. I think you would risk your relationship with them anyway, and the chances of a 6-year-old to change their political views on something, I think it's a waste of time. I think we get the young people, and I think Patsy agreed with me on that. That is our summary. I hope that's all right with you, Mark.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing? That it was great to have somebody who wasn't familiar with all of this already. And so the idea of the the brilliant presentation that you did, he said he would need more evidence. And I was thinking, well, that's really helpful for us to hear, that actually if those slides could have some references, something that you could refer to, so that you could actually, because he was somebody who was saying, well, I will read, because I was saying, well, lots of people I know won't read it,
Yes.
And I thought that would be really, really helpful. And I think the presentation with you presenting it, rather than everybody else kind of trying to do it, would be much better. But anyway, thank you.
Well, I should speak for myself and thank Gia for representing her view and Patsy's view, which were much stronger than mine. And it is true that this is the first time I've seen this, and I'm still asking questions because my reputation goes with anything that I say about some book that somebody wrote. So I don't feel comfortable being as passionate as Gia and Patsy, but it's an interesting thing. And the point that I made, the one point that I made, is that wanting to change the country requires the people who vote. And there's not much that we do as consultants that fits into that political arena. But I would say if the alternative is Keir Starmer, then the question is, how do we get that idea into Keir Starmer's head? Because you can't vote somebody else out, as the Conservatives would be. There's got to be something else. And saying we could collect up a bunch of parties that maybe would do something, that's a joke. If there's a party that will take on your proposition, Keir Starmer's the guy to speak the words. So the question is, how do you get the words into his mouth? That's my personal assessment, not a voted for majority in our group, but I think our group at least has 2 committed people that are going to do something.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you, Gia and Patsy, for your contributions. Philip, the last group report.
Well, we were of one mind, so I think I will only have one feedback. We went down a bit more of a detailed level and said what we're looking for here, if you want to make a change right across the country in people's ways of thinking, then you have, what we could do as professionals and individuals with skills is think of it as a marketing and change management proposition. And each person can actually maybe be persuaded to work in their sphere of influence, whatever that might be, so they're not overwhelmed by the need to change everybody. And then you should hopefully get a sort of ripple out and pyramid type effect. I think there's a slight danger that everyone on this call is from roughly the same sort of background, and therefore it'll be limited, but hopefully there are other people that Mark is talking to in other areas. But I thought also, just before we go on from that, another very important point that Andy raised was that whenever anyone puts forward an opposite view to the government now, they're instantly accused of being biased. Whether it's the BBC, I saw the other day the BBC was accused by the wonderful Nadine Dorris of being infiltrated by left-wing Islington people. I live in Islington, and the chattering classes and all that. So whatever you say, if you don't agree with the government, you're biased, which is a sort of Trump approach to doing things. And we need to think about, how do you counter that? What do you mean biased? Where's the evidence they're biased, and so on. And we also picked up on the point that someone made earlier in the meeting, that people vote on their emotions, how they feel that day. And maybe there are 1 or 2 big points that could actually swing the feeling in the country. I don't know, it might be, the energy prices whizzing up. It might be inflation suddenly going from that very comfortable sort of 2%, 1.5% to 10%. I mean, I remember the 1970s, but a lot of people don't, unfortunately, but 10% is going to be an awful shock for people with mortgages and people further down the line, and people just seeing prices going up every week. So maybe some of those things could actually be so big, they flip the electorate over. And it'd be, I think, important to focus on those rather than Mark's excellent proposition is great for intellectuals. But actually, if you're talking about the mass of people who haven't got time to think about these things and don't know what a chart is anyway, something that says you can't afford to buy anything in the shops now is much more powerful. So somebody needs to think about what those messages are. And we're not at the election yet. Luca made a very good point that the first stage in any change is awareness. So long before the election, we had to get people start thinking about this. If you just try and change people's minds overnight, never going to happen because people hate having their minds changed because they have to admit they were wrong. So awareness and then building up in stages towards something. I take a little bit of hope personally for the fact that Biden got in and Trump didn't, by the way. So the world is not completely lost. My other thought on my side was I know a lot of people who are quite influential, either through friends, colleagues, relatives, but quite a lot of them are Tories. Now, I don't know anyone's looked into who, I saw Mark's list of the Tories who are opposed to this government. I'm wondering if anybody's actually working on that sort of thing. So, for example, we were saying we hadn't got the media mechanism, but YouGov is very powerful in the media mechanisms. Now, YouGov is very closely linked with Ian Duncan Smith. Is Ian Duncan Smith pro or anti the current government way of doing things? I don't know the answer to that. It's also unfortunately quite closely linked with one of the ex-YouGov founders is now a minister.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it'd be worth thinking about what people at this level can do. You know, I know judges and journalists and one of the guys who runs YouGov and so on. So, you know, what can we do with our influential people? Can we actually change the traditional Tory view against these plutocrats? I mean, the previous generation, certainly in my family and friends, were all Tories, and they would be absolutely up in arms of what's going on now, no question. But is there still that residual group, or have they disappeared? I don't know.
Thank you, Philip. Mark, would you?
Well, what a lot of fantastic ideas. I suppose I'll try and take them very, very roughly in the order that they came. So I think David Rigby made the point that as individuals, consultants need to be seen to be professional. And I think that's absolutely right, that anything you do that prejudices your credibility, you shouldn't be doing. And I think that also relates to David Jefferson's point about wanting to see you know, the facts behind these things. So in fact, it's not difficult to see the facts behind these things. I don't think you should believe anything just because I've said it, and therefore in the book everything is carefully sourced, and there's a full bibliography for the book, including website links on the website. So if you want actually to go to the original source document, you can trace your way from the book through the bibliography to the original source document. Most of the sources are things like the Office for National Statistics and the Bank of England, precisely for that reason, that I wanted people to be able to feel secure in the sources. David also suggested, you know, sharing the presentation, and I think that's a very good idea, definitely. Gia mentioned personal contacts, which I think absolutely word of mouth is a very, very powerful way of getting people to understand these things. And you know, hopefully the video doesn't look too bad, and we can get it up on the YouTube channel, and everybody can share that. Russell Brand, I kind of know him, but I must admit I haven't been anything like a close follower. So I know he's very influential, but I don't really know in detail what he stands for. Sharing things at university absolutely sounds like a good idea, and sharing the book or the link with younger people, absolutely. We have a youth movement within 99% called 99% Rising, which is for people who are under 35. And the reason for that is I talked about the year 2050 and how the UK might look if we're not careful. Well, you know, I'm hoping that I'll still be alive in 2050, but I shall be well past my prime. But if you're under 35 today, then, you know, that will be your world. That's the world you'll be living in. So it's really important that that group understands all of this. And then Philip mentioned that we need to change the way that people think, and therefore it is a marketing and change management challenge. I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's a lot that we can learn on that. And it's definitely also true that what I have done so far is kind of putting the intellectual case, and it's not been focused on the emotional side. It's been focused on getting the facts out. To change people's minds, I think it is about emotions. And I think the point about the cost of living crisis is absolutely right. And I have noticed that it cuts through, because we have got a media landscape that doesn't really present what I've been presenting and tends to underplay these issues. But the cost of living crisis has cut through that, because whether the Daily Mail tells you or not, if you can't afford to pay your heating bills, you know you can't afford to pay your heating bills. So I think it's absolutely right that that is a key thing that will cut through. And unless the government really tackles it, that's going to be their Achilles heel. And for them to tackle it, they would have to reverse direction on a lot of things. So I expect them to do a bit of a giveaway 6 months before the election. I don't expect them seriously to tackle these fundamental issues that I have talked about. I do expect them to continue to pretend that they're doing it by constantly talking about growing the economy and levelling up, neither of which they have done so far. And finally, on influential Tories, yeah, I do think there are quite a lot of influential Tories who feel this way. I get the impression, but I don't know for sure, that they're not really properly coordinated. So the Tory party was, as Philip Hammond said in his note, it was kind of captured by the extreme right. And I think that was done in a very disciplined way. I don't think the traditional Tories are yet being disciplined enough. There's an article on the website, one of the most recent articles, which is about traditional Tories versus Johnson's government. And that would probably be a good one to share with traditional Tories, because essentially what it's saying is all the things that you as a one nation conservative have always treasured all your life, all of those values, honesty, responsibility, pragmatism, none of that applies to this government. And therefore, if you're a traditional Tory, you should really be up in arms about this government. So if you've got friends who are Tories, that's probably the article to start with to get them interested. So what a fantastic lot of ideas. Thank you all very much indeed.
And Mark, can I, as chair of the Richmond group, thank you on behalf of all of us. Could we Mark's clear exposition of the facts, and also when I noticed the audience reaction, it's been not only insightful, it's actually been inspirational. And if you would like to see more of Mark, if you do join up with the 99%, there are local regional meetings, which Mark often talks at. So you can hear the 99%'s views on different issues as they emerge, like the NHS. I would also say that as consultants and individuals, we can do things in our own localities and with the people that we know, but we all also have very valuable skill sets, which can be of great use to the 99%. So if you feel you'd like to take an more active part, then please either join up through the 99% or contact me and I'll feed you through. So Mark, can we give Mark a round of applause?
Sorry, just before we finish, just one question. Can we
still
put this link
on the thing? So I'm
can we hold down a second, please, Gia?
I just have one question. Can I put the link on LinkedIn?
Okay.
Or is it not appropriate for LinkedIn?
Yes. No, it is. I normally post all the articles on LinkedIn.
Okay,
So,
all right. So I can post it on my 1,000 or whatever contacts.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Excellent. So if I make a round of applause for Mark. Thank you very much for giving us your time, Mark. It's been a fascinating evening.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Great. Thank you.